Close your eyes and picture a security operations center. What do you see? Well, you may imagine a bunch of different configurations of desks and chairs and computers, alerts popping up, and of course a team of SOC analysts working through all those alerts. What about the front of the room? No matter how you imagine the rest of the space, there's nearly one universal thing that people expect of a security operations center, whether you've actually been in one or just seen it in the movies, and that is the giant dashboard at the front of the room. What do you expect to see on that dashboard? If you haven't worked in a SOC and have only seen movies and marketing literature about them, maybe you imagine there's a map of the world with digital attacks being lobbed back and forth like a high-stakes game of ping pong, where analysts are the only thing saving you from the latest exploit thrown at you from that foreign country. It's a neat thing to imagine and makes for an awesome visual, but those who have done the job know better and realize where the attack comes from has almost no bearing on what we're going to do about it or how we might act on it, so the map actually isn't that useful. If you've worked in a real SOC, you know the actual info we need to see. Actionable information and statuses of multiple types that tell us both if things are operating as normal, and if not, what's going on, who's working on it, and what are all the priorities for all of these different events. This could take a lot of different forms, but it's often things like alert counts and priorities, SLA times, any urgent issues, patching and vulnerability information, tickets being worked with assignment statuses, and much, much more. But here's the problem. Just having that data on a screen doesn't mean it's actually useful and improving your ability to respond, which is ostensibly the point of having that dashboard. It's quite often that SOC dashboards are cluttered with a bunch of raw numbers and flashy but meaningless visuals and alerts that don't tell us what we actually need to know. They end up being more of a distraction than a tool, but continue to exist because everyone feels like that's what needs to be there at the front of the room. Every other SOC has one, right? So let's get something up there that at least looks useful when the tours come through, and unfortunately, that's often where it stops. So how do we fix this? How do we build dashboards that are actually going to help analysts detect real threats, focus on the right alerts, and make faster and better decisions? Well, to answer that, today I'm joined by Ryan Thompson, a cybersecurity expert who has spent years building and refining dashboards for real-world threat detection. We're going to be talking about what makes a dashboard effective, what mistakes security teams make when designing them, the different types of dashboards, and the key things you need to include to make your dashboards work for you and not against you. Let's jump into it.
So my name is Ryan Thompson. I've worked for several different security vendors over the last handful of years. I worked at a place called AlertLogic, which is an MSSP. I worked for Elastic, which for those of you who've been in security for a while is a pretty prominent name. They're the ones behind Kibana and Elasticsearch. And then currently I work for an EDR vendor. I started working at Hewlett-Packard in their procurement organization. My role specifically was figuring out what was a better way to get components together to build a server. So I was looking at different shipping mechanisms, different logistics options to be either more efficient or to save cost. Specifically, they're coming from inventory, forecasting, and costing systems. And this data was all over the place. Big part of data analysis for me at that time was just cleaning up the data, normalizing it, making it to where I could actually analyze stuff across these different data platforms. From there, I moved into my first security role, which was at a place called AlertLogic. They dealt primarily with IDS data. So that's intrusion detection systems. More specifically, we were dealing with Snort. They also had a capability of pulling in logs from host using agents, as well as cloud using APIs. So we had a few different data sources, and my primary role when I started was sifting through these thousands upon thousands of logs. It was mainly a compliance role, but I learned a ton because I was super close to the data. It gave me a really cool opportunity to work with the data engineers as well to improve our ingest, to improve our parsing. So that was an awesome stop in my career. From there, I stayed with AlertLogic and moved into a consulting role. So I had multiple customers that I met with on a weekly basis. This gave me the opportunity to allow somebody else to drive what was important. So my clients would either be interested in vulnerability data, or maybe they were really invested in cloud and had a gap there. Or maybe they're more traditional and they just wanted to take a look at their Windows DCs to make sure nothing was going on that was a little bit fishy. So by allowing them to drive the conversation, it kind of forced me to learn the different log types and learn how to quickly pivot between them to get answers. From there, I moved on to Elastic, where I taught Kibana for the US military. So these people were coming in, they were having to deal with our nation's networks and wanting to know how to hunt across Zeek and Suricata logs. I got to learn a ton about a specific SIEM by some of the smartest people around that SIEM. Working for Elastic, you can imagine you get to know Kibana pretty well. And so this shaped a lot of how I visualize data today. And then more recently, I'm working for another vendor and I'm trying to develop a way to hunt across the cloud control plane. So think of AWS CloudTrail logs, think of Azure logs. How do we sort out all of those admin API calls and find evil in them? How do we know when, hey, this looks like an admin creating a user, but actually it's somebody evil? And so it's a really interesting problem to solve. And I'm back to dealing with those logs, dealing with the ingest, what we need, what we can drop, and then finally just trying to sort out attacker API calls from regular admin API calls. So it's been challenging, but extremely rewarding. Alongside that, I do teach Sec 541, which is cloud attack techniques and detection engineering. And so it allows me to take all that data analytics experience as well as my cloud experience, kind of mush them together and hopefully provide some insights for my students. So that's been a lot of fun.
So how did you make the transition from working with procurement and that kind of data into working with security data? Was that a different mindset, or is that the same mindset applied to different kinds of data?
I would say definitely a different mindset. In the procurement days, I was more looking for historical data, really pulling together some aggregates, and then producing a similar type of scenario with some variables that are changed to show savings over time. Maybe we could save $1 million here or there. And so that mindset is very much, let me pull together this complete scenario that I've got a lot of control over the variables. In security, you're not really proposing changes when you're doing the log analysis or the data analysis. You're really trying to rebuild a picture of what happened and then trying to extract a narrative from that and determine if it's good or bad. So there's a lot of same themes there, but the outcome is very different and your perspective is different. This data analysis and data visualization was an ends to a mean. And so whether that was in procurement or as I moved into security, I needed to make useful things out of this data. And especially with a lot of vendor tools, you could pull some bits of data, but more and more I realized I really just want a raw CSV so I can manipulate the data myself. And I don't think this is a vendor's fault either. I think it's really hard to predict how people want to use data and what they need out of it, the insights. And so more and more, I just realized, give me the raw data. I'll manage that myself and start to build out visualizations that are useful for the end user. I think really the perspective of who's using the data drives what you need.
If you're a team that has a bunch of security data, what's the starting point of I have my data, I want to turn it into a useful visualization? What kind of questions are you thinking of, and how are you starting to approach that problem?
Yeah, starting off, I can tell you that when I first got my hands on a SIEM, it was actually Kibana. We were ingesting IDS data into it. And I said, oh, this is great. I'm going to build one dashboard and it's going to have everything I want. And so I think that's a natural tendency. People say, great, I can build these visualizations. I can just look at a single plane and determine what's happening across IDS data, maybe host logs, all these different places. And I'll say from experience, that's not the right place to start, but it's natural to lean towards that. I think the better place to start is ask yourself, where is it hard for me to ask questions of my data? And so maybe I have an EDR that does an excellent job of letting me find different patterns and rebuild timelines within the tool itself. And maybe my Windows logs, on the other hand, are just kind of sitting around. So that may be a better target. Now, once you decide on your data type that you want to ask questions of, let the data itself guide how you visualize it. So for Windows logs, for instance, you have application, system, security, and a handful of others. Those should probably be how you go about building out your dashboards. Building out dashboards across those different disciplines or different categories and trying to merge them into a single view is really difficult. And so learning about your logs, learning how they categorize them, and going with that flow is usually going to offer a lot less resistance.
Would you say your approach is generally more start with the question and then focus on getting the data into that position, or get the data fully here are all the categories, what are the questions I can ask based on the categories that I have?
Yeah, it's a tough one because it goes back and forth. I think it has to start with answering a question. That's how you're going to get the ability to move away from what is likely an operational role more into a strategic role and start building these things. You do have to have an initial pitch of saying, hey, these are the kinds of things we can answer with this. But I find that once you get into it and you start saying, great, these are the visualizations that I need, here are the fields that are interesting to me, you say, wait, I didn't know that value could exist in that field. I didn't know there was this type of log. Let me go explore that. And so I think it's good to have a starting place, but the idea that will be all you solve within dashboards is kind of a naive thought, because learning those logs better is going to direct you on where to go next.
So would it be fair to say the first step is explore and learn not only the data categories you have, but the contents that might be in the fields for each of those types of data?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Going through and starting at that category level and saying, great, these security logs, what do I have in here? And this is one thing that I've noticed. A lot of the time when an intern comes into a company or onto a team, they say, oh, great, you can build us some dashboards, but you really need somebody who's an expert in that data type. You need somebody who knows how Windows operates to build out Windows dashboards, or knows how AWS works to parse those CloudTrail logs and build useful tables. So you need an SME. And I will tell you, as somebody who's been a quote unquote SME in a topic, I learned way more than I thought I would building dashboards, because you're just in the data, so in the weeds with it that you get to learn a ton.
So when it comes to like building an actual dashboard, how do you organize all of the questions you might ask in individual visualizations into a single dashboard or multiple dashboards and start to approach that problem?
Yeah, so we'll take AWS IAM, for instance. So that's the identity and access management within the AWS cloud. And maybe the listeners aren't as familiar with that type of platform, right? And what actions can be done. But when you take apart that CloudTrail log, you start looking through it. You see things like a source IP address. You see things like the identity that's doing the action. You see things like the event that's actually being ran. And so those are crucial pieces, kind of like load-bearing parts of this log. And we'll get into the types of visualizations later in this discussion, but that's what I want to pivot off of. So when I talk about dashboards, I'm talking about operational dashboards. I want somebody coming in that's either doing incident response or threat hunting. They want to ask questions of the data. And so think about it from a security perspective. If I find an actor doing something interesting and I see they're using a unique user agent, I want that visualization to be there to show me what user agents they've done and be able to pivot into any of those pieces. And so the first part is just understanding what your critical parts, almost metadata of the logs, just your basic ones that are going to be there every single time.
You mentioned operational type visualizations and dashboards. What is that in opposition to?
There's really three different types of dashboards that you can build. This is an oversimplification, but three major ones. You have your exhibition dashboards, and those are meant to go up on the front of a SOC wall. They'll show pew-pew maps. They'll show some really high-level data. In my opinion, those are typically made to go on the wall to fulfill what people think a SOC will look like. It's got little indicators of attacks going from one country to another, and those have their place. They're not for analysts, but that's fine. Then you have your monitoring dashboards, and those are more to drive the business. So if I'm running a help desk and I want to know how many open tickets I have versus closed, or if I want to know what the average time it takes to resolve a ticket, that can be a quick glance and we can know where we stand from a metrics perspective. Operational, which is what we're talking about today, is more, how do I build out something that takes that barrier of having to create queries to ask questions of my data and lower that barrier to present some of that data in a very easy way that doesn't involve training somebody from the ground up to be an expert in a SIEM or some type of query language to be able to ask those questions.
So do you have some example in mind when you say like a visualization that would lower the barrier for understanding?
I don't have a go-to necessarily, but the type of visual that lowers that barrier to entry is absolutely going to be a data table. When I want to ask questions of my data, fun fact, I want data. We have line charts, we have pie charts, we have all these different heat maps. When it comes to just understanding my data, giving somebody even 3 data tables that aggregate high value fields lets them learn a ton about that data. It lets them learn about what values can reside in those fields.
If we're putting data tables up on a dashboard and trying to highlight maybe where things are out of the ordinary, you still have to have that context of, well, is that a good number or a bad number?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't spend a ton of time making judgments about the data when I build out an operational dashboard. The core part of why somebody's coming to this dashboard is they want to ask their own questions. And so what I might find interesting may not be what somebody else finds interesting. Now, I'll say a great tip is, especially in some of the visualizations that show data over time, looking for spikes is super interesting. But then taking a data table and flipping it, saying, give me the events that don't happen very often. Show me the IP addresses that we don't see very often, maybe ASNs that are interacting with our data that is just more rare. So it's long tail analysis is what it really is at the end of the day, but making that a one click away for any analyst in the SOC makes it really, really useful.
So you'd mentioned you used to teach Kibana and threat hunting for the military. How does one approach getting priority lists of charts that they might want to put on a dashboard for something like threat hunting?
Yeah, that's a tough question. It's going to be different for the different data types for sure. What I think is more important is that you find somebody in an organization that knows that data really well and specifically knows security really well. It's going to be driven by the questions they want to ask. And I would say that if you take 9 out of 10 quote unquote SMEs and ask them, hey, what do you want to know from Windows logs? They're going to say, I need to know the event ID. I need to know the machine it came from. I need to know the actor that it came from. And so really those core pieces. Now, the other piece of it that is important, but probably isn't a crucial piece, is the details of what's affecting what. That's harder to say. So when you think about a DNS resolution versus a scheduled task versus a user creation, the target of all of those logs are going to be very different. But what remains kind of a throughput in all those, it's going to be the machine it came from, maybe an IP address, the event ID. All those are critical to get up on a board. We can dive into the raw logs later to answer those more unique questions or more niche questions for the event types.
You had mentioned data tables previously as being one of the core items. One of the things I'm always interested in is like, are there certain visualization types that you find yourself navigating to beyond data tables that you think are really useful as well?
Yeah, I think data tables are the core, right? I think that's really what we want to look at. Abstracting that data to an aggregated view is really, really helpful. And ideally, your SIEM would allow us to filter on any of those aggregated values. So if I see a certain source IP address or if I see a certain user, I should be able to filter that entire dashboard on that. Beyond that, the only other one that I really use is going to be something that'll show data over time. So that could be a line chart, a bar chart, or an area chart. And those are all useful for different things. I think a line chart does a really good job of showing relationships of multiple values over a period of time. So I can see how many security logs came in over the last 3 days and if there was a spike. Maybe I look at activity from a certain user. That can be really useful. Something like NetFlow data may benefit more from an area chart, which shows not only your individual data from certain source IPs, but if you have an overall spike, your area graph should go up to indicate that. Those are the two that I stick with.
Okay. And could you say a little more about which ones you specifically don't like using and why?
Yeah, I've got some strong feelings on this. I think there's only one place for a pie chart, and that's directly in the garbage. When we think about pie charts, really you can only show 2, maybe 3 different pieces of data inside of a pie chart before the slices start getting too small. And I think anytime you get something that's maybe 48 to 52%, let's say on a pie chart, you can't look at that and quickly tell which one's bigger. You have to go look at the numbers that are associated with that pie chart. And so even in a best case scenario, I still think it doesn't do what it should be doing. You need to be able to quickly look at a visualization and make a determination on the data it's giving you. And I just don't think a pie chart does that in any regard. I think your data tables would work really, really well, especially if you have multiple values. So when you get down to that 1 or 2%, a data table is clearly going to state that. Whereas a pie chart is, in a best case scenario, shows small slivers, and a worst case scenario, lump a bunch of the small values into other.
Where does making one of these dashboards fit into the workflow of the average SOC analyst? Like, what I'm thinking here is, do you go in at the beginning of the day, kind of look at your alerts, pick an alert, and then start with the dashboard? Or is the dashboards like a more of a threat hunting thing that you go to when you have time? Like, where do you typically position these things?
I think anytime you need to go ask questions about data, so that could be, hey, I have an alert. I need to dive into this more. Ideally, from that alert, maybe you pick a piece of data to pivot on. Let's say we have an IDS alert that comes in, and it gives you a source IP address. I should be able to click within whatever is alerting and pivot over to my dashboard, and it should be pre-filtered. Now, this is a perfect world. Not all systems are designed to do this, but if I'm designing one, I want that alert to pop up. I want to say, hey, great, I need to go view my IDS dashboard, and I need to view everything coming from this source IP address. or maybe it's the destination, depends on what type of alert it is. And automatically I go over to my dashboard, and it's pre-filtered to show me whatever data that I pivoted on. So show me what other alerts came in from this source IP address. Show me whatever alerts came in targeting this destination IP address. And it gives me some other context for what I'm looking at. And so I think that's good from an alerting perspective. And then from a threat hunting perspective, I go in with a hypothesis and I say, I think this type of activity is happening in my environment. Very easy to do, at least to get an event ID or an event name and start filtering and seeing what's happening. And once again, we can go look for that long tail analysis. The dashboard easily allows us to find other values that we may not expect to see.
Gotcha. So a little bit of threat hunting, a little bit of alert triage work. It might step in either scenario, right? It certainly plays a role in both the proactive and reactive workflows in the SOC.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's another kind of underrepresented use case for a dashboard. So you have traditionally two roles that kind of leverage a SIEM. You have your data engineers or security engineers that are building the SIEM. They're the ones building the parsers. They're the ones ingesting all this data in. And then you have the analyst using it on the other side. And I know when I first started, I was an analyst. I was looking at the data. I said, wow, this is weird. This field should only have source IP addresses, but I'm getting other data. Now that I'm a little bit more mature in my career, I realize, hey, the analyst is the perfect person to find those issues. And so use those data tables to find values you wouldn't expect to see in that data and go work with the security engineers, because guess what? Once they parse it, they've got other tickets. They aren't in the weeds like the analysts are. And so leverage these dashboards to give valuable feedback to your data engineers or your security engineers.
One of the things I liked a lot about the talk you had done for the Blue Team Summit, which is something I'm definitely going to link in the show notes, is you talked about the pillars of dashboard excellence was the way you phrased it. And you had mentioned consistency and interconnectivity and manageability. Can you say a little bit about those factors and what you mean by those?
Yeah, I'll take consistency, which I think is probably one of the most important pieces. So imagine if you were to pull up Amazon.com, and I'm sure that everyone is shopping on Amazon. You probably haven't pulled that up in your browser, but you can close your eyes and you can think about where the major buttons are, right? For Amazon, I know my shopping cart is in the top right. I know I've got a hamburger menu in the top left. I can click and I can go to different things. The search bar, dead center. And what's critical about that is no matter where I go in Gmail or where I go in Amazon, all of those elements are going to remain the same. So my talk was talking about more of an ecosystem of dashboards. So up until now, we've talked about a kind of individual dashboards, but ideally you're building out different dashboards for different types of data. And to link those together and to make it feel cohesive, you need to have the same elements in the same places across your different dashboards. So the way I generally build it is in the top left, I have a description field. Most SIEMs and dashboards allow me to use Markdown. And so that top left, I put a widget there, I size it the same size for every single dashboard. And that's a quick description to where you can know where you are in our sea of dashboards. On the top right, I use hyperlinks to link my different dashboards. So once again, using those Markdown widgets, I can link from one dashboard to the other. And ideally, if you're in the right kind of SIEM, I know Kibana does a really good job of this, I can create that nav bar widget and I can reuse that in multiple dashboards. And so now with just those two pieces, I know where my nav bar is. I can look in the top left to know where I'm at and what kind of data I can expect to see. And that gives me some level of cohesiveness across my dashboards and makes them all feel connected and makes the navigation really, really easy.
Is there any sense of a way to make consistent the actual charts, or is it like the data is so different that you can't really make that consistent in any meaningful way?
Yeah, you can to some degree. So we'll take AWS for an example. I've been doing a lot of work in AWS recently. So you have some of those reoccurring fields. So if anyone is familiar with CloudTrail logs, in every single CloudTrail log, there will be a source IP address. In every single CloudTrail log, there will be a user agent, an Amazon resource name, which is basically the identity. And so those are consistent no matter where you go in that ecosystem. And so for every single AWS dashboard I have, I build what's called a header. So it includes a title in the nav bar that I just talked about, but I also include some core piece of information. I'm always going to be interested in who's doing the activity. I'm always going to be interested in where it came from. Maybe I'm always interested if there was an error message or not. And so building out those to remain consistent across all the different contexts. So I can click on my compute dashboard and see all my EC2 activity, IAM and see all my identity activity. But those widgets will always show me the same data within the context of each one of those services.
On the interconnectivity piece, what are you aiming for there with that factor?
Really what I want to do is I want to reduce the barrier of pivoting between one data type to the other, or even one category to another. And so typically what I'll do, if I'm building out a larger set of dashboards, let's say I have Azure, Google Cloud, Windows, IDS, and NetFlow. Those are very, very different data types. I will likely build a small nav bar in the top right that'll take me to each one of those major data types. And then underneath that, there will be a secondary nav bar that'll help me navigate within that space. So let me paint a picture. I'm on an IDS dashboard. I'm doing some investigation. And maybe I decide, hey, let's go see if anything happened within AWS. I should be able to click AWS on the top right, and it'll take me to likely an overview page for AWS. So give me some high-level details, not really anything specific. But what will happen is that second nav bar that resides under the first will then show me overview, IAM, EC2, all my AWS specific dashboards underneath that. So that interconnectivity piece gets away from this idea that we need to go search through our dashboards or have something bookmarked. Everything should be really, really easy to click through. The other piece of this is interconnectivity outside the bounds of dashboards. If I have Jira tickets associated with my IDS alerts, and that's part of that alert that pops up and it says, hey, here's your Jira ID for what has happened. Or maybe there's an Atlassian page that shows this is more information you can find about this specific pattern, right? Creating hyperlinks with those values that link to other parts of your organization, once again, it just reduces that kind of menial clicking and copying and pasting that your analysts have to do to quickly pivot over to that piece of information. So the more cohesive you can make this, the more interconnected, I think over the long term, the less burnout you get from your analyst.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, right? Is reducing clicking, reducing manual entry or re-entry of fields that are there. Is there anything that comes to mind in terms of other specific examples you may have seen for connecting what's in a dashboard out to other tools beyond ticketing systems? Just because I know that there's probably a lot of opportunities there, but we want to encourage people to be, creative beyond the obvious if there's anything you have.
So there's two different ways that I think of where you can use external tooling. So if I have an IP address and I want to do an IP lookup, I don't know what sites everyone is using nowadays, but most of the time when you look up an IP address using one of these services, if you look at the URL, at the very, very end will be the IP address. And so what that really allows you to build a template for your data and turn that basic text of an IP address into a clickable link. Now, the one thing I will say about that, you do have to be careful with that because now you're teaching your analysts to click on IP addresses. I think that's a safer way to do it in the long run. I don't want to build bad habits of clicking on possibly malicious IPs, but either way, that quick connection to an IP lookup reduces that fatigue. The other piece is when we think about things like Windows event IDs. I know that I have a handful memorized from my Windows log analysis days, but there's a ton out there. Same thing with AWS, which is the world that I live in now. There are a ton of different events that can happen. So AWS is a fantastic example of this. They have very consistent documentation. So the URLs, you can say, hey, if I put in the event name, I can pull up what I need. Microsoft doesn't always do a great job with their documentation, but for their event IDs, it's fantastic. So once again, if I can find a piece of a URL that I can replace with a value that I need more information about, all of a sudden, all of my event IDs can be turned into hyperlinks. Well, I'm one click away from learning more about that event.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think, especially for newer analysts, that can be an enormous help is like 4624, what is that, right? And until they have all those numbers memorized, having the quick reference out to some site that's going to point that out, it can be an enormous help. The one thing I'm thinking also along with that, is there an OPSEC consideration there, right? If you're immediately running a search for something, assuming it's only a search, right? A search for an IP, a search for a hash should be safer than saying like auto submit files, right? Have you ever seen anyone run into problems with accidentally doing something they didn't want to do because of that link?
So I know that if you look up a hash on VirusTotal, for a period of time, there's an API endpoint that you could hit to see how many times a hash was looked up. If adversaries have the ability to search that and pull in how many times this hash was used, if they're only using that executable in your environment, it could tip your hand and let them know that you're at least investigating that. And so you do have to be careful with that. I know at the company that I currently work at, we use a lot of internal tooling for that to where it doesn't hit those public endpoints. And I think that's a smarter way to do it in the long run.
For manageability, as one of the other factors you had brought up, what are you doing to build a set of visualizations that you're able to change and manipulate and maybe redistribute across different types of dashboards over time to make it so it's not an enormous pain?
Yeah, so that's, I think, an incredibly important piece of dashboard management and dashboard engineering is how am I going to make changes over time? And so when you think about if your log structure changes or if you decide that you want to include different pieces of information in those dashboards, are you going to have to go into each individual dashboard and make that change? Are you going to have to go into each individual visualization? I'm using a SIEM right now that has some of those limitations with something called parameters. And so that's just something we keep in mind. I know that if I want to add an additional parameter or an additional filter, I have to do that in each individual widget. And so for long-term scalability, just know you're probably going to make a mistake updating those. On an infinite scale, if you're manually going in through the GUI, it's going to happen. And so anytime you can reuse something, I'm a huge proponent of that. I have a pretty strong Kibana background, and so Kibana does a great job of that. You have a full library of visualizations that you've created, and as you're building out a dashboard, you can go pull any of those in. And so what that means is if I need to make a change across all of my dashboards, I just go change that one visualization that's referenced in all of them, and it updates across the board. And so anytime you can avoid having to go through and individually update things, it's a great win. So one more example of this. This is less about the construction of the dashboard itself and more about either alerting or some of the visualizations. A lot of these platforms allow you to upload a CSV, and we can reference that CSV. And so if you have a list of events that you think are really important today for maybe pivoting or some certain type of activity that you consider sensitive, instead of building out an array of those events inside the query itself, inside the visualization, have that live in a CSV, and then have your visualizations reference that CSV. And now you have one place to update it, and it flows through all your visualizations.
How do you do naming of certain panels in your dashboard, especially so that you can reuse them and it doesn't turn into a bunch of naming just gore?
Yeah, naming gore is a perfect name for that. You can ask anyone who's worked with me closely. This is my weak area, especially starting out when you're trying to figure out what you're going to name everything, how you're building stuff out. A lot of the time you'll get to that save page where it says, hey, what do you want to name this? And you don't have references in front of you. You just name it something, right? This is how that naming gore happens. But once you start to get your feet underneath you and you say, okay, I've got kind of a system. I know what works and what's not working. Going back and sticking with a consistent naming convention, right? If we're going to use dashes, let's use dashes. If we're going to use camel case, let's do that. Whatever that looks like for your environment, deliberately taking the time to go and actually build that out, even if it's retroactively, which is usually when I'm doing it. It's when my coworkers yell at me that I've been naming things all kinds of random patterns that I go back and I fix that. That's a critical point, because when I go through, and once you start using these, when you go build a new dashboard, I know that a good one that I use is platform followed by the data type, followed by the visualization type. So I know that if I'm building on an AWS dashboard and I'm building something with compute, I can go in, I can do AWS-compute, and it pulls up all of my visualizations that have that. And if I don't have that tight naming convention, I'm kind of swinging in the dark there for what visualizations I've already built. And it ends up creating a lot of duplication, a lot of confusion.
At the end of that naming, One of the things I always struggled with was, other than I think the data source is a fairly, intelligent thing to obviously put there. What I've also struggled with is like, do I say logins by count, like logins by username, or do I phrase it in some other way that's more intelligent than that? Have you come up with any great way to like put the actual label on what's going to be in the box?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a great way, but what I've usually done is I try to be as data centric as I can. And what I mean by that is instead of logins by user, I do console login, or I do events by user if it's just a simple aggregation. And so I try to be as clear as I can and use the terminology that's used in the data set itself. The other piece that I do is at the very end of it, I usually put in brackets what type of visualization it is. Now, some systems will allow you to filter that when you're choosing visualization, some won't, but it quickly allows me to say, hey, I want all my AWS pie charts, and hopefully that'll come up with nothing. But maybe something more realistic would be AWS bar charts, and all of a sudden I get everything there for me. So I try to be as descriptive as I can. Sometimes they get pretty lengthy, but that's just part of building a well-architected system, I think.
One of the other things you had mentioned during your talk was quality of life, which I think maybe we hit a little bit on, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. You had mentioned hyperlinks being one thing there, but also documentation and including the raw data on the dashboard itself. Could you say a little bit more about those two things?
Yeah, so this is definitely going to be a little Kibana centric. I've used 6 SIEMs over my career at this point, which I think that averages about a little under 1 SIEM per year. Just switching around through different contracting gigs that I used to do, different SIEMs that have changed through different companies, acquisitions, all that fun stuff. So all that to be said, this is a very Kibana-focused functionality that doesn't exist everywhere else. But what's great about Kibana is I can go save a search, just not a visualization, just a search. So when you think about a SIEM, I build a search into the top, and then beneath that, I can choose what columns I want to present. And so I can actually save that, and I can include that in a dashboard. So I have all my filters, I have all my aggregations all the way down. I get to the very bottom of the page, I've done all my filtering, and now I have a list of different events, and I have the fields pulled out. What's great about it, though, is that is actually raw data. I can click and I can open up and expand any raw log. And so we talked earlier about keeping the analyst from having to go from one platform to another and switching views and bouncing around. The closer you can get that data to the dashboard, the better it is for them. So an example here, maybe we have a suspicious login. We've done all the filtering and we scroll down and we get to those raw logs and we open them up and we can say, oh, yeah, I know that username, or, oh, hey, I know that ASN, or, oh, this was actually a failed login. I can see right here. That keeps me from having to go somewhere else. So anytime you can bring the raw logs closer in, that's even better. For platforms that don't allow you to do that, having some type of click that you can make from the dashboard to pivot into a search, once again, removing that barrier, is super, super helpful. Something I've just started doing, it's building documentation into the tool itself. And not all documentation. You're not going to put your HR documents inside of Kibana or Splunk. That'd be crazy. But there are certain pieces of information, certain gotchas. So a really good example is certain structures within logs, certain fields that may not be super obvious. I can go and I can build a markdown page, or a markdown widget. It would be a more appropriate term. I can build that out and put all the details I want in about these different log types. And going back to that navigation bar, now I have AWS, I have Windows, I have IDS, and then at the very end, I have help. And that can bring me to a whole section where I just have markdown documents that are directly related to the SIEM, whether that's searching syntax, whether that's the logs themselves and details about how they form, or gotchas about our data. Hey, here's some information about how we ingest things and what's filtered and what's not. And so not having them go out to a Confluence page and sort through that mess, having it directly tied in, I found to be very, very helpful.
Do you have any thoughts on how long a dashboard page should be? Is it like you shouldn't have to scroll and that's another dashboard if you're going to have to add more information, or can it be multiple kind of browser length pages of data?
Yeah, that's going to depend on the efficiency of your search, I think. The big thing for me is when you jump into a dashboard, you have to think about what's happening. If you have 7 aggregations, those are all running concurrently against your data. So a couple of things are taken into account. How well is your data indexed? What kind of time range are you looking at? And so within reason, I want that dashboard to load within a few seconds. Maybe 5 seconds is probably maxing out to where maybe I don't need all these visualizations. Maybe I spin off and do another one. Now, if you've got the money and you can put the resources behind it, you can build it as long as you want, right? I think to some degree it gets a little cumbersome to have to scroll through all that data. But yeah, I think it really comes down to how quickly somebody can iterate over the data. So if I can jump in and say, this user is suspicious, oh, wow, they did this action. Maybe that means they pivoted over to another user. If I can quickly pivot between those different views, that makes that dashboard all the more useful. If I'm having to wait 30 seconds to a minute for each one of those to load, I lose track, I get distracted, searches start to fail. And so that's probably time where you need to pull some widgets off of that page, or you need to pony up and add some more resources behind your searches.
Yeah, I didn't think about the performance angle of that, but that makes a lot of sense. It's a kind of a balance of you want more because you get more context for everything you filter on, but then it's also increasing the resources used and the time it takes to load.
The last piece I'll say about the performance, this is what makes it so practical to build specific dashboards for specific data types. Because behind the scenes on all those widgets, let's say we're looking at an EC2 dashboard, the first line in each one of those queries behind each one is going to say, hey, only give me logs that are coming from my EC2 service. And if I have those indexed correctly, that can make that very, very performant, where instead of searching across all these different logs, I'm probably filtering most likely by AWS source first and then EC2 service second. And all of a sudden, we can get a lot more performance out of those logs. Instead of saying, give me all AWS logs, I want to do some advanced regex queries, right? You're going to have a bad time.
The other kind of related question to that is, we hear the term single pane of glass very often. How do you make a decision between one dashboard to rule them all, kind of ignoring the performance piece, even though that's obviously part of this as well, and then having more focused dashboards? Where's the balance there?
So that's a great question. I think it depends on the type of dashboard you're building. For a monitoring type dashboard, yeah, I can probably pull in my top Windows alerts, my top AWS alerts. I can pull those in, but that's not where the investigation is happening. And so when we pivot and we want to ask questions of that data, one of the worst things you can do is start pulling in disparate data types into an operational dashboard, because as soon as you put a filter and you say, I want to filter on this Windows host, all of your AWS widgets are going to go blank because, of course, they don't have that Windows host. And so just think about the use case for those when you want to start pulling in different data types. I really think that maybe one jumping off point for alerts into an operational dashboard that has specific stuff is the right way to do it.
Are there any mental models or patterns or other things like that you find yourself kind of thinking about when it comes to building out dashboards or anything?
So yeah, when it comes to a process, if we were to step back and kind of summarize all the things that we talked about today, I don't have formalized steps. So I'm going to kind of walk through them just as I think about them mentally here. The first thing is I need to understand my logs. And so that's a lot of exploration, probably by somebody who knows the SIEM really well and can build those manual aggregations and learn, here are the logical buckets these logs are going to go into, and therefore here are the dashboards that I should build. The next step is understanding what types of fields are going to be present across every single log from that source. So this comes back to that source IP address. It comes back to that identity, who's doing it, maybe the host, maybe the pattern name, something like that. And then you build out your header. So your header, in my opinion, is always going to include a description, a nav bar, maybe a total count of events, and then those key pillars of data that exist everywhere. And so you kind of finalize that. You really want to understand what that's going to look like. You can go back and change it, but if you've built 15 dashboards, now you have 15 to go update and resize widgets. And so you really kind of want to get that ironed out, at least to a satisfactory degree. You can always revisit as a major initiative later down the line. The next piece is, okay, I've got maybe 5 different dashboards for different AWS data types. And so you go to something like IAM. You say, okay, what's really interesting about IAM? And beneath that header, you can start building out specific dashboards for IAM data. So maybe I want to know where users are being created. Maybe I build that as an individual widget. Maybe I want to know the sign-in failures, login failures over time. That could be another line chart. So you start to get more specific as you move down and you build these out. The crucial piece is you understand, hey, I built out these 5 dashboards. I want to make sure they're all linked. That's part of building out that header. And you can quickly go in between those. There's going to be a lot of checking. You're going to click on IAM and it's going to take you to a compute dashboard. That's going to happen. Make sure you iron out before you push it out to your analyst, I think is probably the best way to do it.
There's one thing I was just thinking as you were mentioning that. Have you ever seen anyone take like their visualizations and their dashboards that are created and align them in some way with MITRE attacks such that you can say like, show me all my dashboards that tell me about persistence, or like one of those higher level kind of techniques?
Yeah, that would definitely be a different approach for it for sure. I know some individual SIEMs allow you to tag dashboards or tag visualizations. And so if I'm looking at user sign-ins, that's probably initial access, right? And so I could absolutely do that. I don't know from an operational perspective, from the way that I've been talking about building out dashboards, those necessarily align with MITRE, because that IAM dashboard for AWS, that could be initial access, that could be persistence, it could be lateral movement, it could be escalation. So it covers a large umbrella of things. But I think the individual widgets, especially as you get more specific into the data, could be aligned with that. I think tagging would probably be the best way to do that.
On metrics dashboards, are there any particularly effective kind of guidelines for what kind of metrics are better put on a dashboard versus ones that just kind of sit there and don't really get paid attention to?
I can tell you for me, the only metric that I really put on my dashboards, please keep in mind my perspective is not to manage a team or manage a process, is to answer questions about the data. So the only one I ever put on my dashboards is, hey, for this dashboard, for what you filtered, here's the total number of events. And so outside of that, for managing a team, that can vary a lot.
I know one thing I wanted to ask you. You had mentioned that you have gone through 6 different SIEMs, which is probably way more than most people have seen in their lifetime. Having that wide of an experience, what is your take on the differences between the capabilities and visualizations between those different platforms? Are there certain things where, in your opinion, when you're doing this, it's like you should be searching for a tool that can do X, Y, or Z? Any kind of guidance there?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question, because I started off with Kibana, and I have a soft spot in my heart for Kibana. It is really good at asking questions of your data as it exists today. It's amazing at that. That's got a reverse index. It's extremely capable. Where it starts to fall apart is when you need to manipulate that data further. So maybe I need to split out a specific piece of a value. Maybe I want the, first 16 octets of IP address and kind of build my own 16/16 CIDR. I can't do that with Kibana unless I take that information, make a change upstream, and re-ingest all of it. And so a tool like that is really good to ask questions, but the questions are probably going to be pretty basic. Whereas something that is like a piped query language, something like Splunk or Sumo Logic or LogScale, that allows you to manipulate that data way more. But the downside of some of those tools is the indexing isn't as performant. And so it really depends on what you want. I would say for a junior level analyst, Kibana is more than enough, and it's going to get you quick answers about your data without a whole lot of fuss about syntax and things like that.
I don't know if you know this, but Justin Henderson and I actually wrote a class back in the day for SANS called Sec 455, which was a 2-day on Elastic as a SIEM, which is where I fell in love with Kibana myself and a lot of those capabilities of making dashboards and that kind of thing. So I was always comparing it to what most of my experience was, which was with QRadar, and the differences in workflow between those two. And what you said there, right, the way we kind of explained it in class was the difference between schema on write versus schema on read, and the ability to have flexibility after the fact. And then it's going to take longer to parse it maybe as you search, but you can do more things, right, without having to re-index it. So
I didn't want to get too far in the weeds on that, right?
Right.
But it's an important thing to consider. It really is, because I'm a big fan of Kibana's performance. And I think for the most part, asking questions out of Kibana, especially if you're using a dashboard and filtering, Nothing comes close to it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you need more advanced queries, especially for building detections, I think that lends itself better to something like Splunk or probably QRadar from the sounds of it.
Where I was going kind of with some of those questions is there a sweet spot of flexibility with the data in any product that you found where you can both get the visualizations you want in a performant way, but also have more flexibility than maybe Kibana provides? I guess maybe the question there is any commentary on the other products that are out in the market in comparison to Kibana?
Yeah, I think if you're going to use something, whether that's Kibana or Splunk or QRadar or any of those, you need to have a tight relationship with your security engineers. So whoever is managing that SIEM, because it's usually not the same person who's running the queries. So if you run a lot of searches on customer ID, so if you're working for a vendor, customer ID is basically your starting point for most of your investigations. And they can do something called indexing. And so that essentially makes that search much more performant when I say, hey, I want this SID to equal this value. And if you put that at the top of your queries, all of a sudden you're not searching across all of your data. You're searching across a subset of it. And it's pretty efficient. Sometimes it'll build those into different repos or different indexes depending on the platform itself. But having that tight relationship with your security engineers is going to allow you to tell them, hey, this is what's important to me. Because guess what? Your security engineers aren't the ones investigating. And a lot of the time, they don't have the same skill set as a threat hunter or an incident responder. And that's fine. That's why they're different roles. But being able to communicate that back to them and then be able to re-architect it in a way that makes it more performant is incredibly beneficial.
Are there any features that you've run into any of those SIEM platforms that you've used that you're like, I wish every platform on earth could do this thing, and there's only one vendor that's doing it right now, and I miss it?
Yeah, I'll give an answer on that. So when it comes to specific features that SIEMs have, there are no standout individual features. I think what's happened is over the last handful of years, these SIEMs have looked at what each other are doing. And there's, at the end of the day, only so many ways you can slice this data. And so I don't see a ton of search functionality that I wish they would expand out to other SIEMs. That's getting very kind of peanut butter spread. Even Elastic just came out late last year with a piped query language. I haven't used it yet. It's on the newer versions of Kibana. That sounds awesome. So when it comes to searching, it's all about the same. I think where I really value some of the functionality that I see in these SIEMs is from that manageability piece of being able to reuse elements across different dashboards. It's not a specific way to search, but it makes my life a lot easier when I only have to update a widget in one spot.
Yeah, certainly. One thing I've been thinking about recently, in 2024, do you think parsing data is something that's getting easier, or is that still like a very relevant skill that most teams are going to need to have? Or is it more like the Azure experience where we're checking a box and things just kind of show up and it's going to be simpler from here on out?
Yeah, I think it is getting easier. I've worked with a ton of different log formats recently, like Okta and GitHub and a lot of the cloud platforms. They're all coming through in JSON. And that's so much easier than what it used to be. The one that comes to mind is Fortinet logs. Not only were they space delimited, but the user could actually determine how they wanted to format that log. They could choose certain fields that exist. They could choose the order. And so especially from a vendor perspective, it was almost impossible to parse. And so I think a lot of these companies are seeing some easier ways to do things in the future. But if you have some of those legacy tools, those challenges don't go away just because the SIEMs are new. Parsing at the end of the day, especially like space delimited parsing or tab delimited logs, those can be very, very tricky. One thing I will say is I've noticed with Azure, I've been spending a lot of the time in the cloud lately. Azure and Microsoft specifically haven't learned a whole lot of lessons about log formatting from how AWS has done it or how Windows was done in the past. So even though it's easy to parse those values coming in from Azure, the parsing isn't what trips you up. It is the formatting. Sometimes a field value, depending on the log type, will be camel case. Sometimes it'll be Pascal case. Sometimes it'll be lowercase. And so as we're ingesting these things, I think it's easier to pull out key value pairs. For certain vendors, specifically looking at you, Azure, I think it makes sense to also add a lowercase filter on that to exclude a lot of the variability that's coming in. And so that's something to consider. Parsing is easier as we move into JSON, but it really depends on the value in those keys and values that change things.
Yeah. And that's definitely not the first time I've heard that exact kind of comment about Azure logs. So Microsoft, if you're listening.
Yeah, not to rip on them too hard, but even some of their GUIDs, right? These universal IDs, sometimes they'll come in with dashes, sometimes they'll come in without dashes. Sometimes a field, if it's empty, will have literally the string null in there. Sometimes it'll be empty. Sometimes it'll say NA. And so some of that consistency could go a long way when it comes to log analysis, but the parsing itself, you can parse it. It's just very difficult to search across.
Yeah. Any thoughts on OCSF and kind of those log standardization attempts that are being introduced with that?
Yeah, I used to teach for Elastic, and this was one of the things that we talked about is these standardization attempts and some of the offerings. Elastic specifically has ECS. I think Splunk has their own. You have this open framework that you're discussing. And I can tell you there's no worse nightmare than being on one of those panels and arguing about if source is going to be SRC or fully spelled out source. That sounds like a nightmare. I am so happy that's being done. I don't have a strong feeling on which one you go with. I think you should probably just choose one. The downside is as identity becomes more prevalent across all these different platforms, as more things become abstracted, you have some difficulty fitting in your logs into these formats. And usually what ends up happening is you fit 90% into this normalized range, and then you probably have to add a few more fields yourself. And so I don't know that anyone is doing full standardization unless you're using an agent from one of these standardization platforms. Like if you're using Logbeat for Kibana with Elastic, likely using ECS as it comes in. That's great. That's best case scenario, but I don't have a whole lot of strong feelings on which one to use. I would just choose one and not do the work yourself.
Do you have any thoughts on products or methods for log enrichment and making logs that you're gathering better? You know, the way that Logstash can easily manipulate things. Of the products you've seen, is there any kind of standout things that people should be using feature-wise or otherwise there?
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of strong feelings on this. I think especially network data comes to mind. Hashes come to mind when you're talking about enriching these things. So if I'm looking at DNS data, you know, I could probably send that off to a third party or ingest a third party's library and pull some more information about those domains. But a lot of the time, I just want to split it by period and pull the top level domain. And even that level of enrichment gives me a lot more insight. I can tell you that majority of your traffic and your DNS request should be going to like a .com or .net, .org. As you do that long tail analysis, some things fall out of the bottom. That isn't necessarily a new service that needs to happen, but that is enrichment that can happen on ingest that I think is really, really valuable.
Yeah, that makes really cool dashboards and tables and threat hunting capabilities. Yeah, absolutely. That was one of my big takeaways from 555 when I originally took it. I was like, there's so much more I can do to my data that I haven't been doing.
I'm a firm believer that if you're an analyst, you need to understand how your data got there and what transformations it went through. And what was interesting is that when I taught for Elastic, we taught the operator side. And so we were like, hey, here's a dashboard. Here's how to build a dashboard. Here's the data flowing in. Here's how to do some basic threat hunting. But like we never at any point stopped and said, hey, like this is where it's coming from. Here's how it's getting parsed, right? None of that. And so that was an interesting one for sure. Because it's for me, I don't think you can just use the tool without understanding the data. But that's
I 100% agree with that. I have a slide literally in 450 where I say like, the best analysts understand where that data is coming from and why it's there and what they're not getting, so that if they're not getting what they need, they can say like, hey, I know there's more to this. Can we turn a few more things on here and like ask for more? So yeah, absolutely. Like that's a really important thing, I think.
On the thing of enrichment. So I just started doing something where basically we have certain patterns that are firing, right? That could be from an IDS, that could be from your own logic, whatever it is. And you're getting these firing every so often, especially from a vendor perspective. I want to know which of those patterns are firing, and have only fired against like one or two customers. That's super interesting to me.
Yeah.
And so I've built a search that runs every 7 days and looks back over the last 90 days and builds out one of those files that says, hey, here are rare events. And then you could build a new widget off of that and you say, hey, here's what's fired. Like not just the rare events, but who it fired with, the context and stuff like that. And so I think that can be really, really valuable. I think what's been interesting for me is I've worked in the vendor space pretty heavily. And you think you have a detection that's going to work great across your customers because nobody would operate like this logically, right? every time there's been at least one person that's operated in this kind of odd aspect. And so finding those rare events and then maybe building exclusions for that specific customer allows you to keep that event pretty quiet. And when it does pop up again, you can say, hey, did we add a customer who's doing things in a weird way? Or is this an actual attack? And so it's a great way for tuning as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Anything else we didn't hit along the way here?
I can tell you from not only having used so many SIMs, but also been in a position where I was teaching people how to use that SIM, putting them in front of a blank search bar is one of the most terrifying things you can do for a new analyst. And there's such a barrier to entry. I call out Splunk for this often. Splunk, if it's blank and you press search, you're not going to get any results back. And so there's no logs. There's nothing in there helping you, getting you to a certain point. And for those of you who use Splunk, you say, well, of course, like you need to select an index. You need to put something in. But for somebody who doesn't have access to anything, they're on the other side of the wall. They know the query or the field is on the other side of that wall, and they just can't see it to build it is really, really tough. Tools like Kibana do a better job of that, where you can press search on an empty search and it pulls back all results. Now I've got some field names. I've got some values. I've got a next step. But even with that, then you need to know the syntax. Is contain something that exists in this query language, or am I using asterisks? And so I really view these operational dashboards as a great way to overcome those initial barriers to asking questions of data, because that empty search bar can be really, really daunting.
Yeah, that's certainly a thing that I think is an interesting potential difference between certain platforms, is their friendliness to newcomers and people who aren't aware of what's going on under the hood. Anything that you want to say in terms of resources that you've created that you want to point people to, or how to contact you?
Yeah, so if anyone wants to get in touch with me, the best way to do that is likely through LinkedIn. I'm not really active on any other socials. And then if you're interested in learning about how to build detections and do threat hunting in the cloud, I'm super excited. I've just started teaching SEC 541. That's the world that I live in nowadays. So absolutely hope to see you in a classroom in the future.
I think that's all I can think of, unless you have any last minute items.
I got nothing else for you, John. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. So, at the end of the day, a dashboard is only as good as the insight it provides. A flashy map with blinking red dots might look cool, but if it doesn't help you detect, investigate, and respond to real threats, then it's just noise. Ryan walked us through the core principles of what makes an effective security dashboard: context, prioritization, usability. It's about giving analysts the right data at the right time so that they can focus on what actually matters instead of drowning in meaningless alerts. So take a look at the dashboards in your own SOC and think, are they helping you? Are they flashy eye candy? Or are they a layer of noise? If they're not making your job easier, it's time to rethink them. And hopefully these principles can help you do that. That's it for today. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Blueprint.